Hello everyone, welcome back. And welcome to our keynote session. To introduce our speaker, it's my very great pleasure to introduce one of my co-conveners. Dr. Yves Colpus is an associate professor in British and European history post-1850 at the University of Southampton, with a particular focus on social and cultural history, gender history, and the history of youth and communications. Yves, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and welcome back, everyone. It's my really very great pleasure to welcome Claire Langhamer as our second keynote speaker at the conference this afternoon. Claire is Director of the Institute of Historical Research. She is also a trustee of the Mass Observation Archive. Claire is a well-known specialist in the history of everyday life and emotions in modern Britain, especially through her scholarship on the experiences of women and girls. She has used the life writings and the diaries collected by Mass Observation to write about a range of topics, including love, happiness, home, and children's lives. Her most recent book was Class of 37, A New History of Working Class Girlhood, which she wrote with Hester Barron. Her current project is a history of feeling in the workplace, and she is working on a book on feelings at work in modern Britain, which is under contract with Oxford University Press. Claire is going to speak to us today for around 35 minutes, I think, Claire, very much on the theme of her current project. And her talk is entitled Feelings at Work in Mass Observation's Diaries. So Claire, if you are ready, I will hand over to you.
Thank you. Is my screen sharing?
Yes, it is, Claire. Your screen is sharing.
Are the slides sharing?
We can't see the slides here.
Do you know what? Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
You know, I'm not going to bother with the slides. Let's just go into it because the slides are not actually that great. Other people have had some somewhat lovely slides. So if it's okay, I will just talk. So first of all, I want to thank you all, but particularly Miriam and Eve and Alan for inviting me to speak. I had COVID just before Easter, so I had a good opportunity to listen to and watch the recordings from the conference before Easter. And I was really interested in the questions of intent, audience, and composition and value that came up. I really loved the attention to the materiality of the diary and the different practices of diary keeping. I found it incredibly useful to think across those often false distinctions between academic historians and archivist historians, and to think collectively about what we are working with and how we analyse it. And I particularly found the questions around genre that came up in a number of places. Polly North, when she talked about diary form as notoriously difficult to pin down. Sharon Ruston, who was talking about notebooks as diary-like. And also Lee, who's just been talking about the COVID diary comics. Alan, I think you drew attention to this in your summary of the first 2 days when you asked, what is a diary? And I think that there has been a productively capacious sense of what a diary might be within the whole of the conference. I'm going to talk really about the way in which feeling operates within mass observation today. And I'm similarly going to be using a quite capacious sense of what the diary form might be. So from its inception in 1937, the social investigative organisation Mass Observation generated very many diaries of differing form and type. These texts sit in the space between private reflection and public assertion. Day diaries, day surveys, responses to open-ended questionnaires that the organisation called directives were explicitly solicited rather than merely collected. Contributors were at times actively coached on what and how to write, and the submissions were almost immediately mined for Mass Observation's many publications and reports. These diaries were written for wildly different reasons. They adopt a diverse range of styles and offer varying degrees of introspection. In fact, they also raise definitional questions about what a diary might or might not be. Within the Mass Observation archive, different ways of writing the self in a particular moment of time blur into each other and speak to each other. The individualized nature of the personal account sits in productive tension with the collective endeavor of mass documentary making. For historians interested in subjectivity, the interpretive move between the individual life and individual lives can be both challenging and provoking. One of the ways that I have tried to think through this relationship in my own work has been through using mass observation, and particularly through the lens of feeling. And the material that mass observation generated from 1937 until the mid-1950s is awash with individual feeling, but it also points up collective mood. The organisation itself did significant work with feeling. It explicitly encouraged an emotional approach in communications with its national panel of volunteer writers, and it employed feeling as a tool within its research practice. So this afternoon, I want to interrogate the work that feeling did for mass observation from three perspectives: the methodological, the empirical, and the relational. I'll talk through the status of feeling within MO's research method. I'll consider the emotional texture of the material, and I'll think about the work that feeling did in binding together mass observation and its writers. So MO made extensive and sustained use of the concept of feeling. For an organisation that was generally more interested in collecting and representing the complexity of everyday life than in offering precise analysis of it, feeling, rather than say emotion, was a helpfully capacious category. And I also tend to use feeling for those reasons rather than emotion or affect. For MO, feeling accommodated the diverse and sometimes contradictory ways of conceptualizing and articulating experience that so often mark out the narratives of ordinary life. For MO, capturing feeling was as important as capturing experience or opinion, and was therefore integral to the organization's research design. Feeling was approached as a form of knowledge, a way of understanding the world, and as such, it merited sustained investigation. The organisation sought ways of collecting collective feeling, mood and atmosphere, as well as personal feeling. And it used personal feeling to then establish that context of more collective mood. Individual mass observers were prompted to reflect on their personal feelings through open-ended questions on a range of topics, such as, how do you feel about 1948? The panelists themselves were conceptualized as meteorological stations, quote, from whose reports a weather map of popular feeling could be compiled. Mass observation used these stations as a way of tapping into a broader emotional culture, often focusing on key locations, communities, or events. During wartime, mass observation moved quickly to find ways of measuring civilian feeling at war, with a particular interest in what it termed mass mentality and mass reaction. The organisation played a significant role both in establishing morale as an area of research and in suggesting strategies through which the state might manage it. The mass observation's interest in feeling predated the outbreak of war and was in fact hardwired into its practice from the start. Its founders were stimulated to action by a perceived disjuncture between public feeling about and press coverage of the abdication crisis of 1936. The day surveys, out of which would later emerge monthly directives and war diaries, began as a way of capturing everyday life in the run-up to the coronation of George VI. From February 1937 onwards, volunteers were asked to maintain a day diary on the 12th of the month leading up to and then moving beyond Coronation Day itself. In these early months, the writers were given instructions about how to record their recollections and were asked to present their accounts in specific ways. In March 1937, they were told that the aim of the day survey is to discover what happened to each observer on that particular day. What is recorded is primarily a factual statement, then an account of any feelings you have, which seem sufficiently important or noteworthy. And diaries were asked to frame their responses around 7 questions. The first 6 covered basic biographical details, although they also included a question about dreams. But a 7th question asked for a different perspective and said, describe your feelings during the day. This somewhat atomized approach, which demanded the separation of feeling from action, would in later years develop into a more holistic engagement with what was described as the live dynamic of whole of feeling and behaviour. Some of the panellists simply ignored the instructions to keep their feelings separate or wrote that there was little to report because of an absence of particularly interesting or strong feeling. A housewife in the Midlands noted, perhaps a little archly, that there seems to be very little in the way of feelings. She continued, amusement at the grocer's remark about haddock on page 4, very mildly annoyed at husband's forgetting local papers, page 4, annoyed with myself for forgetting to lift my child, page 4. All these are normal reactions and not in any way outstanding. A London-based socialist apologised for not following the instructions. I am afraid I have not kept my feelings out of question 3 and question 6. However, I will restate them now in question 7. Others made greater efforts to comply. A Bolton mill worker compiled a separate section on impressions and feelings, tying together his feelings, the atmosphere in the mill in which he worked, and his response to the political system. He said, the fact that I had a cold, that the atmosphere was particularly vile, and that the day was dull were first impressions which gave rise to feelings of the rottenness of the system under which we live. The general feeling in the spinning room, worse paid workers, he adds, is that work is an evil thing, a thing to be got over as quickly as possible. The feeling of futility was a constant one during this day, more so than usual, to see the people wasting their lives, mine in particular, at such an occupation. A schoolmaster's predominant feelings were those of anger towards a colleague, whilst an unhappy bank clerk recorded feeling, quote, that banking is a waste of time. One man found that the task, oh, I'm so sorry, and COVID might be making a comeback. One man found that the task of diary making itself impacted his feelings. I was conscious of the significance of this day almost immediately I awoke. I was frightened that I might not succeed in observing anything of value and wished for some moments that I could become unconscious. I could not make the first move to get out of bed, and my wife got up and made the tea. 2 months later, when a London typist recorded her 12th of May diary, she assumed her feelings were of interest to the organisation and made a point of addressing them, writing, "I must add a word about my personal feelings. I found it most enlightening to analyse my feelings and those of other people who talked to me. I was surprised how much I responded to the atmosphere of the crowd, the cheering, etc. I felt a definite pride and thrill in belonging to the empire, which in ordinary life, with my political bias, is just the opposite of my true feeling. Yet I felt a definite sense of relief that I could experience this emotion and be in and of the crowd. One becomes very weary of always being in the minority, thinking things silly, which other people care about. One must always be arguing or repressing oneself, and it is psychologically very bad. One is fighting against the herd instinct all the time. Therefore, you will understand that the carnival spirit of the actual coronation day really was a holiday for me, and I say this without cynicism. I wonder how many others felt the same. The publication of the Coronation Day diaries as May the 12th, Mass Observation Day surveys, presented a largely unnarrativized patchwork account of popular feeling on that particular day. It was not well received, even within the organisation itself. Confiding to fellow maverick anthropologist Jeffrey Gora, Tom Harrison of Mass Observation said, "It was a crazy idea to have it edited by a whole bunch of intellectual poets." Nonetheless, Mass Observation was from its very inception determined to ventilate feelings as much as attitudes and experiences. And it encouraged its writers to record them in different forms and registers. Both the diaries and directive responses located a life in time and place, constructing a version of the self within the framework of a collective writing project. For Mass Observation, those who submitted their autobiographical accounts operated as, quote, "cameras with which we are trying to photograph contemporary life, subjective cameras, each with his or her own individual distortion. They tell us not what society is like, but what it looks like to them." For its participants and for the organisation, the definitional lines between different types of life writing were often blurry. A core of around 100 writers submitted both diaries and directives, and historians including James Hinton and Jen Purcell have woven these forms of life writing together to sketch what Hinton calls biographical essays. As we will see shortly, the directive project offered structured schooling in the articulation of feeling, which could bleed into the diary writing. The diary format offered an expansiveness that informed the crafting of directive responses. As Hinton explains, regular diary writing fostered the diarist's capacity to respond to questions by articulating the ambiguous, unresolved, contradictory nature of the thoughts and feelings involved in their own ongoing projects of self-fashioning. It was a rare Mass Observation questionnaire that did not address or invoke feeling in at least one of the questions asked. Sometimes questions were framed around specific emotional states: fear of the dance hall in January 1939, hopes for the future in October 1942, worries in May 1945, and embarrassment in May 1948. More generally, the question, how do you feel about, was a determinedly open-ended inquiry, inviting multiple forms of response. The word feel or feelings was often underlined to emphasize what was required, or else the request was explicitly framed around your own personal feelings. And sometimes observers were asked to differentiate between their feelings and their beliefs, or to reflect on the processes through which feelings had changed over time. The focus on feeling was maintained across the entirety of mass observation's first phase. An early directive on personal appearance asked male observers to share their feelings about having, quote, long or untidy hair, and about going bald. The very last question that we have replies for solicited feelings about commercial television, and always these responses are located within the context of the individual life history and patterns of daily life. At other times, the organisation focused more intensively on feeling per se, rather than feelings about other topics, with questions on feelings about feeling. What are the main things that determine your day-to-day feelings? Or what effect, if any, do you think the war is having on your mind and general outlook on life? A question that was asked repeatedly over the course of the Second World War. At one point, the observers were additionally asked to maintain a 4-week-long subjective mood chart. They said, we want observers to keep it by them and fill in every day how they feel. Mark yourself 10 and -10 each day. 10 would indicate maximum cheerfulness, -10 deepest depression. 0 would indicate a normal, neither depressed nor cheerful mood. When it reported back to the panel on this material, it told them that male observers had awarded themselves consistently higher happiness scores than women. A female teacher who did not buck this trend ranked her own mood between -10 and +6, annotating the chart thus. First week, holiday week, but was getting over the loss of my doctor. Wednesday, I saw a film which depressed me very much. Third week, unusually cheerful for me, for no reason that I can give. Fourth week, things went wrong all the week and I felt all the worse for having been so cheerful before. Further context in her response further context for this report can be found in a response she made to another question in the directive on mind and general outlook. And this, I think, demonstrates the success of mass observation in building these layers of feelings and layers of autobiography and layers of the everyday across different modes of reflection. She said, as the war goes on, I am possessed more and more with a feeling of impatience with the apathy, ignorance, and stupidity of people, young enough to know better, who allowed the war to begin. I have a permanent feeling of fed-upness. The end of the war seems so remote that I cannot even look forward to the end of it. But mass observation was not interested in feeling from a purely and only individual perspective. Although the archive material has often been used to map individual lives, mass observation's overriding approach was closer to that of the documentarist than the biographer. It is no accident that documentary maker Humphrey Jennings was involved in the project early on. In its foundational pamphlet titled simply Mass Observation, Tom Harrison and Charles Madge claimed that, quote, we do not intend to intrude on the private life of any individual as individual. Collective habits and social behaviour are our field of inquiry, and individuals are only of interest insofar as they are typical of groups. While the organisation made complex and sometimes contradictory claims about its agenda and purpose, a commitment to observing the collective is evident both in its choice of name and in its contextual approach to diary and autobiographical writing. Both the diaries and the directives were archived by month of production rather than by individual. Mass observation spoke of generating, quote, a sort of documentary cross-section through which a relatively rapid reference may be made to any given period or subject. It did not set out explicitly to record individual lives for their own sake. Those who wrote for mass observation also tended to see themselves as part of a bigger picture. Penny Summerfield's description of mass observation as a social movement, quote, a loose organisation of an unlimited number of members whose voluntary commitment depended upon a shared sense of shared objectives, speaks to the fluid boundaries between organisation and panel, observer and the observed. A recognition of collective endeavour was notably apparent in a letter sent to the panel during the crisis of May 1940. The backbone, they said, of the mass observation movement, and the unique thing about it is its panel of part-time observers. Our view is that the increased tension of the war ought to make the whole of MO more determined than ever to carry on its work, because we believe it is important work and that we should be inconsistent and unscientific if we give it up just because there's a war on. Thank you very much for the work you have done so far. If anyone who has not yet done so would like to keep a diary and send us instalments once a fortnight, we shall be very glad. Mass observation could feel very much like a community, even if its members did not know each other personally, although some did. This was a community with a distinctive emotional texture and which manifested distinct emotional styles. Those who wrote for mass observation had diverse motivations for doing so, and unsurprisingly, the organisation was keen to understand these. In October 1937, panellists were asked, why did you join mass observation? What do you think it is for? What do you yourself most hope to gain from it? And what suggestions have you for work that we should undertake? 10 or so years later, the panel were asked, what are your main feelings about mass observation? The responses to these questions help us understand not just why people wrote, but what participation in the project meant to them. They allow us to follow Jenny Shaw in thinking about their writing as, quote, elicited and solicited within a social relationship. Some of the panellists wrote out of a sense of active citizenship or because of the significance of their particular historical context. And we saw that there in Lilith's paper, that sense of the COVID times as a very distinctive moment for people to record their lives in particular ways. But some wrote out of a commitment to scientific inquiry and a belief in the value of what mass observation called anthropology at home. Some were simply curious about the organisation and about everyday life. One said, I'm very interested in the details of ordinary life. Some just enjoyed writing or felt that their voice was important and should be heard. For others, being part of the national panel served a more explicitly emotional purpose, either providing a release for, quote, pent-up emotion of a turbulent sort, a space for introspection, quote, whilst one was surveying a mass, one might also be including oneself in the mass, or practice in describing what one writer talked of as scenes, feelings, accurately and vividly. One Guildford housewife volunteered her words because she had already been, as she put it, mass observing myself for some time. Mass observation cultivated a sense of community among its national panel by using regular bulletins to keep them informed about its work and publications. These communications quoted from the accounts that the national panel had submitted and emphasised the scientific value of panellists' participation. The prospect of appearing in these reports, or even better, one of Mass Observation's publications, clearly incentivised some of the panel. A civil servant wrote that, quote, "I hope to have what I have written printed down in black and white for many to read." The organisation also used its newsletters to encourage panellists and diarists to feel part of a distinctive group. A bulletin of August 1937 quoted one mass observer who was holidaying at Lulworth Cove. He said, "As I write, I wonder whether there are any people at Lulworth who are also mass observers. It is rather booking to think that there may quite well be." And of course, there have been other mass observers at Lulworth Cove, as Mass Observation was able to report. Its efforts at community building clearly worked. A colliery worker spoke of the gain of happiness in doing that which I love and the spirit of fellowship with friends and unseen friends. The act of writing to Mass Observation was steeped in feeling, in part because the topics covered by the questionnaires and the encouragement to write at length in the diaries, but in part because it sat within an evolving long-term relationship marked by trust and intimacy. As a London-based poet put it, "In writing these notes, I have the feeling of being in touch with an intelligent friend, one who doesn't expect too much, nor do I myself stand on guard, as in creative writing, expecting too much of myself." But this was a social relationship within which the observers were encouraged to view themselves as equals. A sense of collective endeavour permeated observer contributions, as well as communications from the organisation itself. So Mass Observation's panellists felt they were active partners in an important project, and they articulated an acute sense of ownership over Mass Observation itself. Suggestions about future directions were not uncommon and were in fact actively encouraged. So as the Mass Observation panellists felt that they were active partners in an important project, and they articulated an active sense of ownership over the organisation itself. Suggestions about future directions were not uncommon and in fact were encouraged. In October 1937, a clerk suggested that the organisation should propose a radio broadcast featuring some of the panel members, perhaps hoping to be one of those selected. He suggested that, quote, "This personal touch would bring added interest from the listener's point of view, and hoped that you will consider fully my suggestions." A decade later, a long-term observer requested a deeper connection with the organisation's workers and writers. Quote, to be able to meet sometimes for the purpose of a chat about MO and its work. Or an extended bulletin with more news, and maybe there could be something like a personal column for news about mass observers. Another long-standing contributor suggested that MO should lend their own publications out to the panel, quote, perhaps arranging that one should post on to the next on the list. In these and many other ways, Mass Observation was conceptualized as a community by those who wrote for it, even if it was a community that was imperfectly executed. It was also conceived of and felt as a set of ongoing relationships. So to conclude, Mass Observation collected autobiographical accounts in various forms across the mid-century moment. Some of these were explicitly described as diaries, some as day surveys, and some as directive responses. Within the archive, we might find the same person making contributions to all of these genres or just one. And they sometimes referred across their different modes of response. It's certainly clear that for the organisation, as well as for the writers, the lines between these ways of writing the self and recording daily life and feeling often blurred. The organisation's very first wartime directive asked panellists both for their reactions to BBC's wartime programming and for, quote, a careful account of how you spent the evening of Saturday, 9th of September. So again, that merging, that blurring of genre. A commitment to and encouragement of the ventilation of feeling is one of the strands that ties the Mass Observation Archive together. For MO, feeling was a form of knowledge as well as a research methodology, an object of study and a way of understanding the world. It was essentially a useful category of analysis. And this was not the only work that feeling did within mass observation. The panellists felt themselves to constitute what we might conceive of in Barbara Rosenwein's terms as an emotional community. Mass observation's mid-century work anticipated some of the ways in which feeling became a privileged form of knowledge in the 21st century in Britain. In his recent book, Nervous States, political economist William Davis claims that feeling has, quote, taken over the world and that democracies are being transformed by the power of feeling in ways that can't be ignored or reversed. He says, this is our reality. We can't reverse history, and nor can we circumvent it. This historical era needs to be traversed with unusual judgment and care. But I think that by exploring the ways in which mass observation, its diarists and volunteer writers worked with feeling in an earlier period as a distinct method, as textured data, and in relationship building, we are perhaps able to nuance a sense that the mobilization of feeling is a peculiarly 21st century phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for a really wonderful talk, really raising really central questions for us in the conference, I think, about the kind of definitional terms of the diary, but also opening this up for us from this perspective of histories of feeling. It's really wonderful. And thank you for keeping brilliantly to time, which has left us with 20 minutes for questions, if that's okay, Claire. Alan is very kindly going to chair questions coming in. So I will, in a moment, if Alan is still here, hand over to him. Same sort of process applies. So for those of you who've joined as participants, do please feel free to use the raise hand function. For those of you who've joined through Eventbrite, do feel free to use the Q&A. Alan, might I jump in with a sort of a version of a chair's privilege and ask Claire a question to get us started? Claire, I was really interested in you reflecting on mass observations, reflection on the sort of success of tracing feeling within their work. Do we get a sense of any individual writers, any individual observers themselves reflecting on their own developing sense of self-recognition in this process of writing for the project? I mean, are there any kind of sort of examples of longitudinal analysis, I suppose, of observers writing over time who might seem to be sort of feeling a greater sense of self-worth, self-recognition over time?
That's a really great question, Neve. Thank you. There is, partly because mass observation tells them to do it. So mass observation is constantly asking people to be really reflexive in their writing. So that question, you know, do you feel like you felt you should feel? They do this a lot during the war. They do it a lot in the, they ask people to anticipate how they're going to feel about the piece when the piece comes in 45. They then ask people how they feel about the piece. They ask them whether they feel like they thought they would feel. And then later on, they ask them to reflect about how they feel now, about their feelings about the piece in the past. So it's really kind of reflexive to its core, really. But I think your question asks for something more about the development of kind of individual diarists over time. And there are, a number of the diarists do write and continue to write for months, years, and some write for decades. So the classic example of that would be Nella Last, who wrote for Mass Observation until 1965. I mean, she was writing diaries for Mass Observation well beyond the point at which Mass Observation was operating as a kind of, the kind of organization that it was operating as in the 30s and 40s and early 50s. You know, by that time it was a more of a kind of opinion polling organization, and frankly wasn't really interested in the diaries that were being sent by these very keen people. And Nella Last's diary does give that sense of just how, not just reflections on the process of reflecting on feeling in a diary form, but also the way in which writing over time, writing a diary over time can become an essential part of somebody's identity. And she very much was. I mean, you know, the Victoria Wood sort of play based on her diary was called Housewife 49, and she really embodied that identity over time. So I think, yes, it does. It happens in the second phase of MO as well, from 1981 onwards. And you can see some interesting ways in which form changes over time. So some of the people who write for MO from 1981 onwards start off writing, typing, or start off writing and then typing, and then word processing comes in, and there's been some quite interesting work done by some former Sussex colleagues, James Baker and David Geringer, on the use of personal computers in people's writing. So I think that itself nice. There's one person, one businessman, who starts off in his responses getting his PA to type up his diary entries, and then when he retires, he moves to writing them himself. So they're nice projects to do around how that shift looks over time.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, just a reminder to people at this stage that if you are a panelist and you've been sent a panelist speaker link, you can ask a question by raising your hand, your virtual hand, and we will pick it up that way. If you are participating through the Eventbrite link, then you need to send your message in through the Zoom Q&A function. And we do have a hand raised, and that's from Miriam. So Miriam, floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this very challenging and very interesting talk. It's more or less a follow-up to Eve's questions and to some of your answers you've made. I would be interested to know how much mass observation was initially conceived as a sociological tool, which very soon could be seen as a historical tool. So was there any sort of discussion about how this tool perhaps could become something else? And this would be from the perspective of the project initiators, as well perhaps from the participants. I know you've started answering this, but could you sort of go on with this question? Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Yes, it was. I mean, I think at first it was seen as a sort of more of an anthropological tool, hence that sense of mass observation being anthropology at home. But it's, I mean, it's worth noting that Charles Madge goes on to be the first professor of sociology at the University of Birmingham. So that sense of sociology is kind of hardwired into the project, carries on. But this sense of MO as a kind of documentary organization really, or an organization of documentarists, does kind of sit alongside a sense of the historical value of what is being generated. And Mass Observation, and particularly Tom Harrison, is very good at selling the value of what MO does. So he doesn't miss the trick of selling MO as something that has historical value and will have historical value in the future. But I think also there's amongst the panelists themselves a self-conscious sense that what they are contributing will matter for historians in the future. And this is encouraged by the organisation, particularly in the early part of the war, when they encourage people to record diaries and to respond to directives and to keep going, particularly in those really difficult times in early 1940. Where people can legitimately be anxious that their writings might fall into the hands of an invading force, and they've written down all of their thoughts about the war and all of this stuff. So there's some anxiety there, but still, the diarists and the organisation have the sense that this is important. It's important to record it now for the benefit of future historians. And again, as Mass Observation develops in a new form after 1981, you again see those quite self-conscious reflections on the value of the words for future historians. It's quite lovely really to read, because you do get that sense of having a conversation with somebody across time, because they have you as a historian in mind as they are writing their recollections.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for other questions to come in, I'd like to ask one, and I'd like to go back to what you were saying about sort of feeling and writing feeling. And I say this feelingly as someone who used to have very long untidy hair and who is now going bald and who has strong opinions on both. But I just wonder, did the MO ever give guidance to any of the diarists on how to approach the issue of writing personal feeling, either individually or collectively? Or indeed, was there correspondence between groups of diarists about how to go about doing that?
Up to a point. I mean, Mass Obs is both quite instructive, but also or quite keen to instruct and quite keen to get what it wants, but also simultaneously very keen to leave things open. So there's often this narrative of say whatever you want in whatever way you want, which is part of this kind of genre crossing stuff that goes on, and they often muddy the waters anyway by kind of a lack of or an openness about the various different things that might be included in an answer. There are particular odd pointers. So at the beginning of the day surveys in 1937, there is a longer kind of section where they talk about, well, what is it that we want from you in terms of feeling? And there are some reflections on that in the book that comes out of the day surveys. I think the questions themselves for the directives often point people in the direction of what could be included in talking about feeling. And they, at various points, encourage people to record their dreams as part of the story of the day. And so, once something's been suggested, then people start adding that in. So there's then a lot about dreams and whatever. And they do point up to people, they often say, don't think that we're using feeling to mean opinion. What we actually mean is feeling. So, they underline it in the text. So there is guidance within a broader kind of context of openness, really, which is why in some ways the directives, the open-ended questionnaires, can often end up reading very much like diaries, because people just draw on what's going on around them to make their responses. And that's why I like moving between the two, really.
Thank you very much. Now, I know I'm appearing on screen as Amanda Jones at the moment, but the real Amanda Jones is actually participating and has her hand raised for a question. So, Amanda.
Thank you. Hello, yes, thank you, Claire. I'm very interested in how the writers saw mass observation as a community and how they felt about it. And I wondered, did this sense of belonging and this desire for a wider shared communication come as a surprise to the people who were reading what was coming in to them?
That's a really, really good question to think with, Amanda. I think that certainly in some of the fictional accounts of Emo, it's sort of presented as a surprise. So there's in Housewife 49, the mass observation office is kind of portrayed as a kind of pokey little place, and the mass observers are really a little bit baffled by why all of these people are sending this stuff in, and quite don't really understand why there's such commitment and sense of community. But I don't think that isn't accurate. I mean, I think the community was actively encouraged by the organization, and they in the early days, they knew a lot of people who were involved. I mean, there were these little communities within communities amongst the people who wrote for MO. So people who know each other through a kind of, being politically on the left, people who know each other through kind of artistic circles. So you get this sense that there are communities within the community that kind of know each other. But the language that Emma uses is very much one of we. So I think its title, kind of its name, mass observation, is sometimes seen as a little bit problematic, as a kind of top-down approach to, looking down on the masses. But of course, that wasn't its intention. It was that we are the masses, and collectively we observe other people and ourselves. So that sense of an active community is there, kind of even in the title that they give to themselves, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm looking for any other questions at this stage, either through the Zoom Q&A or from the participants. So it's a wonderful opportunity and a last chance. In which case, I think, Claire, you've probably exhausted our questions. I mean, it was such a comprehensive presentation, and I'm going to hand back now to Ian.
Thank you so much, Alan. Yes, thank you, Claire, again. I'd like, on behalf of everybody here, to thank you for a really stimulating talk, amazingly so, given the kind of short length of time we asked you to speak for, because I think it's really pushed us to think further about diaries as evidencing individual lives, and as also a potentially much more fluid genre, with application for multiple projects. So I think you've really opened up some key questions about this genre of the diary for us so well. So thank you. If we were in a room, we would all be clapping as I am now. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Claire.